So here's that video, and I'll make it a little larger so it's easier to see. Obviously, the quality is pretty poor. I have annotated the video as best I could. It's difficult sometimes to tell who is firing a shot when, because it's at night and the muzzle flashes kind of light things up generally, but I've taken my best guess. So what we'll see is on the left of the screen is the homeowner, and there we go. Where you see that white washed out area, that's mostly where you'll see the homeowner. And then on the right side of the screen around the vehicles in the street are where the bad guys are. And I've made little annotations on the left side of the screen at the top, on the right side of the screen, where it appears to me either the homeowner or the bad guy were firing shots. So let's take a look at this encounter. Again, remember, it's about 2 o'clock in the morning. The homeowner was awakened by his security cameras. In fact, there are thieves in his driveway trying to steal his property. He goes out there with the gun on the left side of the screen. It looks to me like he fires a warning shot or two into his own driveway. We can get into the prudence of that later. And then there's a generalized exchange of gunfire with the thieves, and then the thieves drive off firing a Scythian shot, a parting shot back at the homeowner as they drive off. So that's a verbal description. Let's run through it. It's only 30 seconds long, and I'll probably play this a couple of times during the show. Okay, let's play it now with some commentary by yours truly. So we'll see the homeowner here on the left. The bad guys are accessing the vehicle. Shot by the bad guy. Looks like a warning shot for the homeowner to me. It looks like it's down. Another bad guy shot. Warning shot. Warning shot. Bam, 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 bam. So definitely in this video clip, the bad guys shoot first. No question about that. Now, the homeowner arms himself with a gun, goes out to protect his cars. Are you allowed to use deadly force in defense of property in Tennessee? No, you're not. Are you allowed to arm yourself when you're investigating whether there's a crime against your property taking place in your driveway? Sure. No reason you can't. And it seems pretty clear that the homeowner here was not the initiator of deadly force, that the bad guys fired at him first. So while you're not allowed to use deadly force in defense of property, are you allowed to use deadly defensive force to defend yourself against a deadly force attack? Of course you are. So was the homeowner privileged to shoot back at the thieves who were shooting at him? Yes. So why is he charged with a felony? Well, it's because of the manner in which he fired back. Because for a use of deadly defensive force to be justified as self-defense, one of the elements of self-defense is the element of reasonableness. Reasonableness. You have to be acting in a reasonable way. A reasonable and prudent person in your circumstances would have acted in the same manner that you did. And of course, the whole purpose of self-defense is to be neutralizing the threat against you in a reasonable manner. By the way, if you don't have this 5 elements of self-defense law cheat sheet, every claim of defense of self and others is based on up to the same 5 elements, no matter what state you're in. We provide this cheat sheet for free. It lists the 5 elements, provides a brief description of each. If you don't know these 5 elements, you can't possibly understand how use of force law works. You can get this, again, for free. We don't charge a penny for it. It's just a PDF download at lawofselfdefense.com/elements. So your use of force has to be reasonable, which means it can't be negligent and it can't be reckless, because by definition, negligence and recklessness are unreasonable uses of force. In negligence, you didn't know you were creating a risk, but you should have known. And in recklessness, you knew you were creating an unjustified risk of death or serious bodily injury, and you did it anyway. So is that what the homeowner was doing here? To illustrate, there are ways of using a gun in self-defense that are reasonable, and there are ways that are doing it that are unreasonable. What would be a reasonable way, a manner of using a gun in self-defense? Well, there's someone threatening you with deadly force harm. Let's presume the elements of self-defense have been satisfied. You raise your own pistol, you place the muzzle on that threat, and you depress the trigger. If you have the opportunity, you use the sights. But in any case, you are directing the threat, your defensive force, at the threat against you. It's an affirmative, intentional use of deadly defensive force against an imminent, unlawful, deadly force threat against you. That's a reasonable use of deadly defensive force. And if you act in a reasonable way, and you're justified, you're not acting recklessly because you're not creating an unjustified risk of death or harm to others. Because your conduct is justified, because you're acting in self-defense in a reasonable manner. Now, what happens if one of those rounds that you fire at the threat overpenetrates and strikes someone else? Or what happens if you just miss and the bullet hits a bystander? What's your legal liability there? Well, it ought to be none. If you acted in lawful, reasonable self-defense and non-recklessly and non-negligently in a reasonable way, your justified intent in firing at the threat, that intent, that good intent, that justified intent follows that bullet wherever it goes. So if it strikes a bystander, that's unfortunate, but it's not reckless because it's not an unjustified risk of force. So that's if you're firing your gun in a reasonable way. What if you're firing your gun in a non-reasonable way? That's not reasonably likely to neutralize the threat against you. What if you go outside and close your eyes and just do a mag dump in your neighborhood, a neighborhood like this, where houses all up and down the street? So you're just blindly firing rounds around the neighborhood. You're not pointing the gun at a particular person, a particular threat that you've identified. You're engaged in what? Kind of suppressive fire? Just hoping you're going to hit a bad guy? The trouble is, if you're doing that, every round you fire, undirected, without a reasonable probability of actually neutralizing the threat against you, is a danger to everyone else in that community. Now, if you're out on the open ocean, well, then you're not endangering anybody else. But if you're in a community like this, every round you fire is creating a risk, and that risk is unjustified if it's not a reasonable exercise in self-defense. And closing your eyes and doing a mag dump is not a reasonable exercise in self-defense. It's not reasonably likely to actually neutralize the threat against you, and yet it's creating a risk of unjustified death to everybody else in your community. That's what recklessness would look like in this scenario. So, but how would we know? Wouldn't it be reasonable to presume that this homeowner is, in fact, he's seeing bad guys with guns shooting at him and he's putting the muzzle on them, maybe even lining up the sights on them and engaging in reasonable self-defense? In which case he's not acting recklessly. Here's where we get into a problem. And this happens all the time, folks. This homeowner decided to explain what he did to the cops who responded on the scene. He didn't simply say, I want a lawyer. I'm asserting my right to silence. I'm asserting my right to counsel. He didn't say, hey, those guys fired a lot of shots. Make sure you collect the brass out in the street when they were shooting at me. That's evidence that they were shooting at me. That's why I shot back. That would be helpful to tell the police, to make sure they recover exculpatory evidence, exculpatory witnesses. Hey, we've got security cameras here. Make sure you get the video. That might be useful to tell the officers, but you would, and then assert your right to silence and assert your right to counsel unambiguously. But if you go beyond that and you try to provide a detailed explanation of what happened and why you did what you did to the responding officers, or even worse, to the investigators afterwards, you're opening yourself up to a tremendous amount of risk. And you have no idea what you might say that could bury you legally. You think the cops, you think the responding officers and the investigators know exactly what you need to say to create legal liability for yourself, criminal liability? Of course they do. This is their profession. Especially the investigators are trained interrogators. So certainly, folks, once you've been Mirandized, you ought not be making any substantive statements to anybody without your lawyer present, and probably not then. Probably when your lawyer's present, he'll be doing the talking, not you. And this is a great example of how this homeowner, who probably thought he was acting perfectly lawfully because he's technically ignorant of the legal boundaries for the use of force. It's the most common thing in the world. The cases I consult on for clients to say, I can't believe I'm getting prosecuted for self-defense. I bet that's what this guy is saying to his lawyer right now. I can't believe I'm getting prosecuted for self-defense. Because he didn't know where the actual legal boundaries were. He had no idea he stepped over them. But you know what the courts don't care about? They don't care about what you thought your privilege to use deadly defensive force was. They don't care what you thought the legal boundaries were. They don't care what you heard on the internet or what your CCW course taught you or what the retired cop down the street told you would be okay. They don't care about any of that. They only care about what the law actually is, which of course is why at Law Self-Defense, we teach the actual law.